everybody, and welcome to the Court of Public Opinion. I'm Jeremy Cordeaux. Peter Clayton's behind the camera. As I said, I think, I hope you had a great Easter. Absolutely. But we'll get to all of that after the birthdays and whatnot. April 12, 2020, Sterling Moss. What a great sportsman and icon he was. British author, racing driver, celebrity, did everything. Anyway, he even did the NASCAR thing in America, believe it or not. He dies at 90, but he was pushing the envelope most of his life. A survivor. 1999, the US President Bill Clinton is cited for contempt of court for having given intentionally false statements in a sexual harassment civil lawsuit. I did not. Anyway, we won't go to that. But he survived it by just being a very naughty little boy. People kind of loved him for it. I saw him when he was here in Adelaide at a speaking engagement. In fact, I got him to sign his book. And people loved him. People loved him. Polio vaccine tested by Jonas Salk, announced to be safe and effective, and is given full approval by the US Food and Drug Administration. 1955, which would have been about the time, what I would have been 5 years old, and I can remember having that. It was a red liquid that you took in a little white spoon. I remember that. No arguments. David Letterman, an American comedian and late-night TV host, was born on this day in 1947. Don't know why he's grown that huge white beard, but he's a character. He is. I like David Letterman. Bill Haley and the Comets, Rock Around the Clock, 1954. I remember the record. It came out on Brunswick, was the record label. Bill Haley and the Comets, Rock Around the Clock. Didn't take off, of course, until the movie, The Blackboard Jungle. That was the launching pad for it. Sometime later. In 1861, Fort Sumter in South Carolina is attacked by the Confederacy, which was the beginning of the Civil War in America. 1861. Terrible war that one was. Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, I mentioned his birthday the other day, becomes the first person to orbit the Earth. Vostok 1 it was, 1961. Tiny Tim, the American singer and ukulele player, tiptoe through the tulips and a few other things, but he was a character too. I met him. Born in Manhattan, New York, he died in 1996, but he was born in 1932 on this day. Franklin D. Roosevelt, 32nd US President, Democrat, dies in office with the war almost over. Didn't quite make it, dies of a stroke. He was 63 years of age. He was born, that's back in 1945 anyway. That's when he died, just at the end of the war. 1966, the first B-52 bomber in North Vietnam. These were the great big aeroplanes that used to go and carpet bomb the bejesus out of that country. And it's a funny thing, and I think Putin is going to discover this about Ukraine. The human spirit of somebody doing something to your country. People are not easily defeated when they have an invasion of their country. Anyway, I've not been to Vietnam. I must admit I'd like to. I think I'd like to see it. Communist country, of course. They won the war. Why shouldn't it be anything they want it to be? Entertainer and restaurateur Sonny Bono is elected the mayor of Palm Springs in California in 1988. He sadly ended his life in a skiing accident, I think. Don't do that. Don't climb ladders and don't go skiing, my advice. Anyway, Happy Easter, happy Passover, happy Ramadan. A special time for a lot of people. Orthodox Easter next week, which is, I guess, Russian and Greek Orthodox. Happy Easter to everyone interested in that. I was amazed the other day, speaking of Ramadan, to see a tin of boot polish. And on the side it said it was halal. How could boot polish be halal? It means, and I looked it up, in Arabic it means permissible, as defined in the Quran, permissible. Would Muhammad object to you polishing your shoes? I don't get it. Anyway, apparently people, manufacturers of all sorts of things, buy or pay for a halal certification. A real money spinner, particularly if you're trying to sell things into Muslim countries. I wonder why the Jewish religion didn't franchise the kosher endorsement. After all, that's in the language. People talk about something being kosher or not kosher. I would have thought there would have been dollars in that. Controversy, speaking of dollars, over shopping hours in South Australia. It is, let me get the words right, it's a balance, the government says, between shoppers and workers. Well, good luck with that. The truth, of course, is that the Shoppies Union in South Australia controls the government, the Premier, who used to run the Shoppies Union. Nothing much is going to happen if the Shoppies Union doesn't decide to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down to, I can tell you that. It's 25 years on since the signing of the Northern Ireland Good Friday settlement. Oh, I don't know what you'd call it, peace agreement that put an end, or at least a pause, to all that sectarian killing, which had raged for 30 years or more. They called it the Troubles. God, that was an understatement. A lot more than trouble. 25 years on the 10th of April. And they're still, well, trying to keep it as a peace agreement going. You would have seen the story by now, I'm sure. The Sydney Morning Herald reports here that the take-home pay of 10 million Australians will be slashed by Anthony Albanese's Labor government, which has decided to scrap the so-called supersized low and medium income tax offset. You might not have ever heard of that before. But this is an interesting way to help people with the cost of living, wouldn't you say? It says here, more than 10 million middle-income Australians will face one of the largest tax increases in history. Whoa! That's kind of sort of gone under the radar a bit, hasn't it? For something of this size and importance. This tax break was put in place in the last days of the Morrison Government, and it reinforces, frankly, what I've always said to you. Taxes will always be higher under Labor. Inflation will always be higher under Labor. The cost of living will always be higher under Labor, which will feed through eventually to unemployment. It all comes down to economic management. Now, if a government doesn't get that right, it gets nothing right, sadly. But I am surprised there isn't more being said about that. Just on the tax offset, Chris Richardson, respected and independent economist, says here, the end of the low to middle income tax offset would be felt throughout the entire economy by households already facing financial pressure due to high inflation and the RBA's aggressive tightening of monetary policy, which means the lifting of interest rates. We are talking a substantial amount of money here, a significant change to the take-home pay of 10 million workers, earning between $34,000 and $126,000. I mean, God, that's got to be everybody. Well, most people. You would have thought that the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, would have called a media conference to spread the good news, to announce the good news. Just joking. But I'm surprised that the media hasn't done more with it. But to put it into perspective, the tax offset is twice the amount that Australians spend every month on eating out across the nation's cafes and restaurants. That's a lot of money. This will just make it that much harder to make ends meet. While the government bangs on about lifting real wages. The word hypocrite does come to mind, frankly. Can you believe, with building companies collapsing all over the place, the CFMEU, which is the Building and Construction Union, the trade union movement generally, is in open revolt and want more pay increases, higher wages. I wonder why they can't see the big picture, what their demands may do to the big picture. You don't kill the goose that lays the golden egg unless, of course, that is the big picture. Perhaps they haven't noticed that all these building and construction companies are falling over. What will your demands do to that? I wonder. And speaking of such, I heard that teenagers, kids, basically, arrested in Queensland the other day for demonstrating against the NAB because that's the NAB, funded various coal mining companies. Would somebody like to tell these kids that China buys most of our coal to fuel the thousands of power stations which help them maintain the second strongest economy in the world? I got a high regard for kids. I'm sure they would be able to join those dots. I don't see them demonstrating in front of the Chinese embassy. Just what do you make of this? I find this interesting. There's a motion before the Victorian Parliament to give retiring, sacked, disendorsed and fired politicians an 18-month lifeline should they lose their job or an election, whatever. The taxpayer would have to give them an 18-month pay period, their salary for another 18 months to adjust to the private sector. Can you believe that? It would be based on a backbencher's salary, which would be about $280,000 a year, to help them adjust to earning an honest living. It's not here, but would you imagine the people of Victoria would like that when you consider the debt that they are struggling to cope with? The problem, of course, is that it will be the politicians who get to vote on this, get to decide on this. I would imagine there'd be so many snouts around that trough, the motion will probably sail through quite easily. Absolutely. What a hide, what an absolute hide. What does it take to get Mr. and Mrs. Average Australia out demonstrating for common sense? This is the sort of thing I'd demonstrate against. Ramping in public hospitals here in South Australia, and I don't doubt anywhere else in the whole country, is worse than ever. But here in South Australia, March was the worst month ever for ramping. 4,000 hours in 1 month. Far worse than under the previous government, a situation which certainly contributed to its demise. Labor said they'd fix it. Elect us and we'll fix the ramping. That was it. Labor now says, this is the latest, Labor now says, give us time. In 5 years we'll have it fixed. I'm sorry, I think we should apply the same impatience to this government that we applied to the last government. Don't you? Huh? That must be embarrassing for Anthony Albanese. Warren Mundine. Don't know if you saw it. I don't see that it's being reported widely, but let me bring it to you now here in the court of public opinion. Warren Mundine, being interviewed on the subject of The Voice, pointed out something that can only be described as an inconvenient truth. Now, he is a highly respected Aboriginal elder and leader. He said, with over 280 different Aboriginal tribes in Australia, each with its own country, and you only have to look at the ABC or listen to the ABC to hear all these countries being acknowledged. Each with its own country, one tribe or one spokesperson from that country cannot speak for any other Aboriginal in any other country. What could you do about that? Amazing. I think Warren Mundine belled the cat. This whole thing has nothing to do with getting the advice of Aboriginals, because clearly, according to their own culture, they can't. Nothing to do with the advice of Aboriginals. It'll be the advice of the activists who will pretend to speak for Aboriginal people. But of course, they won't, because they simply can't. Now that, ladies and gentlemen, should be the end of the whole thing. But the conspiracy of the media to close down and not report anything that is likely to be anti-The Voice is truly frightening in a free country like Australia. Believe in yourself, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jeremy Cordeaux. Peter Clayton and I will be back tomorrow. Thank you for viewing the Court of Public Opinion.